in this season of planting the seed, I think my conversation with him is really going to be unpacking how Asia's booming food market. So we're looking at countries like China, Vietnam and others, Malaysia and others, and how they could transform the outlook for South African agriculture. A pleasure to have Wandile Sihlobo join me in his capacity as an agricultural economist. Thank you for joining me, Wandile. Welcome to the show.
Thank you. Thanks for having me on.
Thank you very much. Let's look at, I don't know if you, perhaps let's start with the trends report by ABSA. I don't know if you've had a look at it. Any insights or any reactions about what you saw there?
I mean, look, I've seen the work done by our colleagues at ABSA, which I think it's fantastic work because basically they're mapping up what are some of the key things that are shaping the sector so far. And one of those that always take my attention is around the livestock industry.
Yes.
Partly because of its significance in the farming sector of South Africa, because about half of our farming economy is livestock and poultry, but also because of its position in making sure that we achieve inclusive growth in South Africa. It is one of the sectors that is making headwinds on that and can continue to do that at scale, because remember, if you think about the black farmer participation in livestock, they account for about 34%, while in a number of commodities, they are still at 10% and even far less on that on a range of the others. So I look into that, but the key thing this time around there was the fact that there are problems in the livestock industry, particularly the foot and mouth disease that in South Africa we continue to struggle with, and it continues to be a challenge, and it limits our participation in export markets, increases the input cost for farmers. So it is one of those trends. But I think beyond that, when you think about grains, vegetables, fruits, it's really a positive, because the summer rains of 2024-25, they were brilliant in ensuring that we achieved the greater yields, to an extent that while we struggle with animal diseases, this sector, we think at Agters, it will grow by roughly 8.5% this year, following a year of contraction, of course, which speaks then to that broad recovery of agriculture.
Right. Well, that's a happy new development in terms of that 8% growth that you mentioned. But October 2025 was described as a milestone for South Africa's agricultural exports. Let's dig a bit deeper. Let's talk about, the specific developments that took place and why they matter, particularly at the trade trajectory that we see ourselves in this particular diary before we get into 2026.
Yeah, so when one thinks about the South African agricultural sector, generally it is what we would consider as an export-oriented farming economy, which means that about half of our produce goes to export markets. So when we think about expanding agricultural production, either in terms of growth, ensuring that we create more jobs, or even in aspect of saying, let's increase the participation of everyone in the sector, that entails having to till new land that is sitting in government or former homelands and all of those activities. And in doing that, that increases the output. And we have then to take this produce somewhere if already we are exporting about half of what we produce. And we've been struggling on expanding to a number of markets. The African continent, for example, accounts for about 48% of our agricultural exports. We send out to the world about just under $14 billion US. But we thought that the deeper penetration in the African continent is not possible in the near term. We had reached saturation level in a number of countries. And of course, in the Americas, there are all of the US tariffs and all things. And we see Asia and the Middle East as some of the new areas at which we can still expand our participation, because so far the penetration of the South African agricultural produce in a number of Asian markets is still very low. And these Asian markets and even the Middle East markets, many of them, they spend over $20 billion US importing food each year. Then we want to be part of that. And I think in October, seeing the South African president and some of these ministers, really the leadership in South Africa, going to Indonesia, going to Malaysia, Vietnam, and making sure that South Africa registers in the minds of the people there, as well as our interest regarding trade and investment, is an important step. But the key task really begins now, because then the boring, the technical, and the difficult work begins, where the Department of Trade Industry in South Africa, together with DIRCO, Department of International Relations and Cooperation, alongside agriculture and many other industry departments like mining, they have to go to these countries and talk to them in terms of the exports and do the scientific work. Because if we don't do that while our name is still on top of mind of the leaders, we will lose out. And I think this is why then October, in registering us in that export diversification, was so important, especially for Asia.
Right. If you just tuned in, thank you for being here, for planting the seed as we revive the culture in agriculture until 2 p.m. in Central African time. My guest in this hour, Wandile Sihlobo, economic expert when it comes to agriculture, or agricultural economist, that's the correct term. He's joining me, and we really are looking at export possibilities for trade, between African countries, particularly using South Africa as an example, and of course Asia. So look, we're cutting across various sort of countries in Asia, from Malaysia to Indonesia to Vietnam, etc. Wandile, I think one thing that I really enjoy about the AgriView that you host on YouTube is how you are teaching people within agriculture and showing our people how they can reproduce themselves, and that there are possibilities for markets to open. But there will always be concern around trade growth and how it possibly is still benefiting only large commercial producers first, or prioritizing them first. So let's talk about that, because that is quite a huge problem, considering the space of smallholder farmers and how big that's getting. So what steps are being taken, or rather what steps should we be taking to ensure that smallholder farmers and emerging farmers also benefit from these expanding Asian markets?
Yeah, so the first step I would say is, when the markets open, all of the farmers of a particular commodity in South Africa benefit. Some may benefit because it is their actual produce that goes to the particular market, but others benefit because as the large-scale farmers are exporting their produce to these new markets, then that opens a room in the domestic market for the medium and small-scale farmers to actually be able to have space and a shelf space and place their markets. And the nice thing about the South African agricultural sector is that the price transmission, we really are interlinked to the world market. So the price that you are seeing here really reflects all of the factors that are influencing prices globally. So in a way, for me, I always say, look, if we can get the large-scale, high-quality product out to the export market, while at the same time working to increase the quality and the scale of the medium and small-scale farmers so that they meet the specifications and then they can take advantage of the local market, that's the right step. If then, of course, we can aggregate and have the volume for small-scale, so that they too can benefit from the large scale, from the export markets directly, then we do that. And I think there are steps that are being done to ensure that it's not just one side of agriculture that benefits, but it is what one would call shared prosperity in the South African agricultural sector. And that shared prosperity comes through what the country has drafted, which I would say many African countries should begin thinking about this, which is that we have in South Africa an agriculture and agro-processing master plan. Right. What this master plan does is it takes a commodity approach and then it overlays it with a regional approach. So you would hear South Africans talking about commodity corridors. And then when it takes those corridors, it also does what we call a deep dive value chain. And in doing that, it outlines a couple of things. One, what are the opportunities that still lie in this oranges value chain? But also in terms of markets, in terms of production, in terms of processing, in terms of jobs. And then it says, what are some of the challenges that are constraining that expansion in this value chain? And then it would mention, even if it's issues of logistics, issues of finance, issues of crime, issues of infrastructure. And then we say, how do we address those and who should be doing that? And all of the stakeholders that are in that value chain, they begin working on that. And then we move and move. And we have a number in the diverse agricultural sector We have about over 36 commodities in agriculture that we put to export markets. But we have been able to take a couple of years since the time of Minister Toko Didiza, now Speaker in the National Assembly in South Africa,
Right.
working on this plan, and Minister Steenhuisen coming in and saying, how do we continue with it? And that's really what gives us a vision of closing the gaps between these two agricultures in South Africa and seeking to see the shared prosperity in the farming economy.
All right. Okay. Matt, it sounds really exciting, and I think what I'm getting from your response is really planning ahead and sticking to the plan as much as we possibly can. But with what you've just said, Wandile, let's look at how South Africans can strengthen their export infrastructure. So we want to get to a point where we can officially meet the growing Asian demand effectively. Let's talk about what is possible and what needs to happen so that we can align in that manner.
Where we sit now as South Africa, we are, of course, punching above the weight, because if you think about us as a country, we are what we categorize as semi-arid country. But if you think about the global agricultural exporters, we sit at number 32. We are the only African country in the top 40 agricultural exporters. And we're not proud of saying we are the only ones in Africa. The key question is about what are we doing right here in South Africa? Can Zambia take some lessons from that? Can Cote d'Ivoire take some lessons in that? Can Malawi take some lessons in that? And so that then we continue to grow as a region and have these regional value chains. But what we are doing in South Africa in ensuring then that we meet those demands that are in Asia, one is making sure that in each of those markets, we have a free trade agreement or some preferential trade agreement which seeks to reduce the tariffs that we experience. A key example, for example, is today, if you are comparing a South African farmer with the Australian farmer, and both of us actually are farming in a reasonably similar environment, and I would say in other commodities, we far surpasses the Australians. I mean, they've just been here about 2 months ago to come and learn how we are producing citrus. Okay. And we went down to Australia to actually interact with them, and they were very impressed with what they saw here. We were also very impressed with what we saw there in their wheat production. So we are doing that knowledge exchange with Australia, and I think that's the knowledge exchange that with Africa we should also be doing with. But the key point about that is that the Australian farmers in the Chinese market, they experience zero tariffs. If you are sitting in South Africa and you are trying to sell your wine to China, you either, if it's bottled, you hit a tariff of about 14%. If it's bulk, a 20% tariff. While the Australians that are similar like you, because the folks in Adelaide are producing in a similar way that you would see in Stellenbosch, and we are the quality reasonably the same, but now they get to have a much more greater penetration in that Chinese market. Then the conversation about today is about how do we get the same deal as them. Beyond that, there is a biological aspect, which is what we call the phytosanitary barriers, to ensure then that on specifications of production, the chemicals that people use and all of those things, we meet all of those needs. That's why I was saying then the political discussions are the first and foremost important in registering us. Then the nitty-gritties of the tariff discussions by the trade negotiators and the specific affected departments discussing the scientific aspect and the product specifications so that those markets are fully open. And then I think once that happens, then we will be way more able to compete rigorously in those markets and really earn our place. Right now, we are less than 2% in a number of those Asian markets, dominated by South Americans, Australians, and the US.
Man, it's really amazing. And, for me, just that possibility, that exchange of knowledge and looking at how we can really efficiently reproduce ourselves economically on the African continent is awe-inspiring. Wandile, what's coming up on AgriView on your YouTube space?
I mean, I think some of the things that we looking, of course, that we'll be talking about is the season ahead. What's going on in terms of production, what outlook, what volumes are we looking at? Because that is very useful in terms of those that are planning and thinking about growth, thinking about inflation. But of course, the other aspect is the specific nitty-gritties about capacitating the departments that are necessary to ensuring that the export activity gets to be a success. We'll also be talking broadly about the African continent, especially the Southern Africa and Sub-Saharan Africa region, about what our impressions going to 2026 would look like. And one of the key things that we have been emphasizing is that now the aid that used to come through the World Food Program and the others is no longer there. So we are seeking to advance the message of what each of the African governments can do to ensure that they support their farmers to produce, so that in times of needs, at least we do have the volume, because we can no longer go and cry to the World Food Program and ask them to do something for us. We have to do something for ourselves as Africans. And I think those are some of the topics we will be delving in as we head towards the end of the year on AgriView.
Absolutely. We will be watching, so check out AgriView with Wandile Sihlobo on the YouTube space.